Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, let's jump right in, because today we are unpacking one of the absolute most fascinating paradoxes in ancient history. We're talking about Anu. He was the ultimate supreme deity of ancient Mesopotamia. I mean, he held the highest possible title in the entire pantheon, king of the gods. But here's the wild part. For thousands of years, he was a king who seemingly wielded almost zero active power.
It really makes you stop and think, right? Like, how could a deity be recognized as the absolute source of all kingship, both divine and human, the literal wellspring from which all legitimate authority flowed, and yet completely lack a dedicated, active cult following for most of ancient history? The ancient Mesopotamians absolutely recognized his supreme rank, but they basically never actually prayed to him. Now, to wrap our heads around Anu, we kind of have to understand how the Mesopotamians viewed the universe itself. See, Anu was the divine personification of the sky. And in their mathematical system, the number 60 was the foundational base. It represented ultimate completeness, absolute divine perfection. And honestly, that perfectly mirrors Anu's role as this abstract, completely untouchable heaven. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll be covering his role as the supreme figurehead, his cosmic family, his rare mythological appearances, a pretty dramatic late-era rebranding in the city of Uruk, and finally, his surprising links to Greek mythology. All right, let's get into it. Starting off with Section 1, the supreme figurehead, and understanding the concept of Anutu. So the absolutely crucial concept here is this idea of Anuship, or Anutu. You have to understand Anu wasn't just a powerful king, he was the very concept of authority itself. Anutu was the ultimate divine mandate. Even the other gods, the ones actually managing the day-to-day affairs of the universe, they had to draw their executive power directly from Anu. He was literally the battery that powered all legitimate rule. We see this perfectly captured in the famous Babylonian epic, the Enuma Elish. When the gods are praising Marduk and recognizing his absolute supremacy, they don't just say, "Hey, you're really powerful." No, they shout, "Your word is Anu." Think about that. Invoking Anu's name wasn't about calling on a specific guy in the sky to come down and help you. It was the ultimate, undeniable stamp of absolute authority. And this authority was literally mapped out onto the physical world. Mesopotamian astronomers divided the night sky into 3 distinct zones, or ways. Enlil had the northern zone, Ea got the equator, and Anu, well, he was placed right smack in the middle, overseeing the intersecting stars. His authority was, quite literally, the foundation of the cosmos. But here's where it gets really interesting. There's a stark visual contrast between Anu and the rest of the pantheon. Most of the other gods were highly anthropomorphic, meaning they were depicted as human-like figures, actively engaging in wars, having love affairs, dealing with earthly drama. Anu, on the other hand, had virtually no human-like iconography at all. He was represented purely abstractly. Usually just as a horned crown singing quietly on a pedestal, he was distant, abstract, entirely hands-off. Moving right along to Section 2, Cosmic Family and Associations, or as I like to call it, the Divine Board of Directors. So Anu's family tree is, well, it's massive. His spouses, like Ki or Orash, typically represented the earth, which makes sense, right? It perfectly complements his role as the sky. And his kids included the absolute heaviest hitters of the pantheon, gods like Enlil, Enki, and the storm god Ishkor. But what's really wild is that he also fathered some much darker offspring. We're talking terrifying beings like the Lamashtu demon, the Asaku, and the Sabiti, who were essentially personified weapons. But the key takeaway here is that Anu functioned mostly as a genealogical figurehead. He was the ultimate ancestor. In fact, when ancient texts refer to the Anunana, which is the collective term for the great gods, it literally translates to offspring of Anu. He was basically the chairman of the board. He provided the necessary legitimacy to the younger, more active gods who are the ones actually out there running the universe. Which brings us to Section 3, Myths of a Passive God. This is where we look at Anu in action, which, spoiler alert, happens very rarely. Let's take the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example. Anu's daughter, Ishtar, gets rejected by the hero Gilgamesh. So what does she do? She goes crying to her dad and demands the Bull of Heaven to get her revenge. Now, Anu is really reluctant. He actually points out, quite reasonably, that she probably provoked Gilgamesh in the first place. But Ishtar basically blackmails him. She threatens to raise the dead to eat the living. So Anu caves and hands over the bull. You see, even when he does act, he has to be heavily persuaded by the more active deities. Then there's the fascinating myth of Adapa. So this mortal, Adapa, breaks the wing of the south wind, and Anu summons him to answer for it. The god Ea decides to trick Adapa, warning him that Anu is going to offer him the food and water of death, so he absolutely must refuse it. But here's the twist. Anu, acting as a totally fair and surprisingly generous judge, actually makes a genuine offer of the food of immortality. But because of Ea's trickery, Adapa refuses it. It's a great story because it shows Anu as the supreme judge, but one who is easily undermined by the scheming of the active, boots-on-the-ground gods. Now, things get absolutely chaotic in the Hurrian tradition. In the Kumarbi myth, Anu is actually an active participant in this brutal cosmic succession crisis. First, Anu overthrows the primeval god Alalu. 9 years later, Alalu's scion, Kumarbi, attacks Anu. And in the fight, get this, Kumarbi literally bites off Anu's genitals. It's wild. And this bizarre act actually impregnates Kumarbi with Anu's seed, which eventually leads to the birth of the storm god Teshub. It's just a wildly violent cosmic passing of the torch. Now we hit section 4, the late Uruk revival. This is basically a massive theological corporate restructuring. Let's quickly trace the timeline here. In early Uruk, Anu was around, sure, but the goddess Inanna was the one who completely dominated the religious center at the Anna temple. For literally millennia, Anu was mostly just invoked symbolically by kings. But then, fast forward to the Seleucid period. This is the era right after Alexander the Great, and Anu is suddenly dramatically elevated. Out of nowhere, he becomes the active, reigning head god of Uruk. So how exactly did that happen? Well, after a rebellion against Persian rule, the traditional clergy of Uruk were completely dismantled. The old Aeona temple collapsed as the center of power, and stepping into that vacuum was a new set of local families who were fiercely dedicated to Anu. They built this massive new temple complex called the Beet Resh, complete with a colossal ziggurat. Essentially, the local theologians literally rewrote the rules. They redefined Anu from being this distant, hands-off figurehead into a highly active ruler directly responsible for the entire firmament. That leads us perfectly into Section 5, Echoes in Greek Mythology, where we'll explore the lasting cultural legacy of the sky god. Remember that completely bizarre Hurrian myth we just talked about, where Kumarbi bites off Anu's genitals? Well, when we dive into Hesiod's Theogony, which is basically the foundational text for all of Greek mythology, we see a ridiculously striking parallel. The Greek sky god Uranos is overthrown and castrated by his own son Kronos. Scholars are pretty much in agreement that this Greek myth directly mirrors that much older Near Eastern tradition of Anu and Kumarbi. The idea spread like wildfire. And there's another fascinating connection, right there in Homer's Iliad. Back in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Ishtar is spurned, flees to heaven, and cries to her mother Antu. Well, in Book 5 of the Iliad, the goddess Aphrodite gets wounded in battle, flees up to Mount Olympus, and cries to her mother, Dione. Not only are the scenes practically identical, but linguists point out that Dione is literally a feminization of the name Zeus, exactly the same way Antu is just a feminine form of Anu. It's a direct cultural transplant, clear as day. Which naturally leads to a really intriguing scholarly debate. When the Greek-speaking Seleucids were ruling Mesopotamia, and Anu was suddenly elevated to the active head god in Uruk, were they intentionally syncing him up with Zeus? Some historians think this whole theological restructuring was a calculated move to parallel the Greek king of the gods. Now, the hard evidence of a deliberate merger is still heavily debated, but the timing is incredibly suspicious, wouldn't you say? So to bring it all together, the ultimate paradox of Anu is captured just beautifully by Assyriologist Paul-Elaine Beaulieu. He notes, functionally, the active head god was Enlil and later Marduk, not Anu. Anu is the sky. He was the title. He was the literal source code of power. But for thousands of years, he was almost never the one actually running the universe. I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. If the absolute ultimate power in the universe requires no active followers, no daily prayers, and basically zero active intervention to remain totally supreme, what does that actually say about how the ancients viewed the very nature of authority? Maybe, in their eyes, true power wasn't about action at all. Maybe it was simply about existing above the fray. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it sparked your curiosity to dive even deeper into the ancient world.